You have probably had one of those moments when a question appeared in your mind that you immediately tried to push away, not because it was offensive, not because it was impossible to answer, but because you already sensed what asking it might cost you. Maybe it happened while sitting in church listening to a familiar Christmas story. Maybe it happened while watching your child perform in a nativity play. Maybe it happened late at night after reading the gospel accounts for yourself, instead of hearing them explained by someone else. You noticed that the story everyone seemed to know suddenly felt more complicated than you remembered. You wondered whether you were questioning history or whether you were questioning part of your own identity. That is the strange thing about deeply rooted beliefs. They rarely feel like opinions. They feel like memories, even when they came from other people. The virgin birth occupies exactly that space for millions of people. It is not simply a historical claim. It is a symbol of hope, a declaration about who Jesus was, and for many believers, an essential part of Christian theology. At the same time, it is also one of the most debated claims in the New Testament because it sits at the intersection of faith, history, textual interpretation, and human psychology. Before anyone decides whether it happened, another question deserves attention. Why do people become so emotionally invested in the answer? Human beings rarely evaluate evidence in isolation. We evaluate it alongside our relationships, our communities, and the stories that have shaped our lives since childhood. If every person you trust has always treated something as unquestionably true, questioning it can feel less like intellectual curiosity and more like betrayal. That emotional reaction does not automatically mean the belief is false. It also does not automatically mean it is true. It simply reveals how identity and belief often become inseparable. Imagine someone raised in a family where every Christmas included readings about the angel announcing the miraculous conception. That story is attached to parents, grandparents, songs, traditions, and moments of love. Now imagine another person who grew up believing that miraculous birth stories were common features of ancient literature and therefore approached every such account with skepticism. These two people may read the exact same passages and walk away with completely different conclusions, not because one is more intelligent than the other, but because they began with different assumptions about how the world works. This is where psychology quietly enters the conversation. Confirmation bias is not simply believing what you want to believe. It is the tendency to notice evidence that fits your existing framework while giving less weight to evidence that challenges it. Believers and skeptics are both vulnerable to this. A believer may immediately dismiss every historical criticism as an attack on faith. A skeptic may dismiss every theological explanation before considering whether it accurately represents the belief being discussed. Both can become more interested in defending their side than understanding the question itself. If we step back from those instincts, the discussion becomes more interesting. The earliest Christian writings that most scholars date are the letters of Paul. These letters emphasize the death, resurrection, and significance of Jesus, but do not explicitly describe the virgin birth. Some readers see this silence as meaningful. Others argue that Paul's letters were written for different purposes and cannot be expected to recount every aspect of Jesus' life. Silence alone rarely settles historical questions. The Gospel accounts introduce another layer. The infancy narratives appear in Matthew and Luke, while Mark begins with the adult ministry of Jesus, and John opens with a theological reflection about the eternal Word becoming flesh. Some readers interpret these differences as evidence that the Gospel writers selected material according to their theological goals, rather than attempting to produce identical biographies. Others see the differences as signs that independent traditions existed within early Christianity. Historians often distinguish between what can be established through historical methods and what belongs to theological conviction. Historical investigation can analyze texts, compare sources, examine language, and evaluate cultural context. It can ask when documents were written, how traditions developed, and what early communities believed. It cannot directly prove or disprove a supernatural event because miracles, by definition, fall outside the ordinary patterns that historical methods normally evaluate. That limitation frustrates people on both sides. Some wish history could confirm every element of faith. Others wish history could eliminate every supernatural claim. Instead, history often delivers something less satisfying but more honest. It tells us what people believed, how those beliefs spread, and what evidence survives, while leaving metaphysical conclusions to philosophical and theological judgment. This uncertainty makes many people uncomfortable because uncertainty feels like weakness. Yet uncertainty is often where genuine thinking begins. We usually prefer simple answers because they reduce anxiety. The human brain likes stable patterns. Ambiguity requires effort. It forces us to live without immediate resolution. That is why controversial questions frequently become emotional before they become intellectual. Once identity becomes involved, evidence alone rarely changes minds. Think about how often people defend positions they inherited rather than positions they independently examined. Religion is not unique in this respect. Politics, culture, family traditions, and even sports loyalties work in similar ways. The community gives the individual a framework through which reality is interpreted. Leaving that framework can feel like social exile. Throughout history, birth stories surrounding extraordinary figures have sometimes carried symbolic meaning. Ancient cultures occasionally associated remarkable leaders with miraculous origins, not always as literal historical reporting, but as a way of expressing significance. Recognizing that broader literary environment has led some scholars to ask whether the gospel infancy narratives should also be understood partly through theological symbolism. Other scholars respond that the evangelists present these accounts as rooted in real events and that symbolic meaning does not necessarily exclude historical reality. These competing interpretations demonstrate why the discussion remains active rather than settled. Neither side simply lacks information. They often prioritize different kinds of evidence and different philosophical assumptions about what is possible. Underneath those debates lies another question that is rarely acknowledged. Why do people need certainty so badly? Certainty provides psychological comfort because it reduces the burden of continual evaluation. If every important question has already been answered, life feels safer. Yet the search for truth sometimes requires admitting that our confidence exceeds our evidence. That admission is difficult because confidence feels powerful. It attracts communities. It inspires followers. It creates the appearance of stability. But confidence itself proves very little. History contains countless examples of sincere people confidently defending ideas later shown to be mistaken. Sincerity and truth are not identical. Neither are doubt and error. Sometimes doubt is the beginning of deeper understanding rather than its enemy. Consider how children naturally ask difficult questions without worrying whether those questions fit accepted narratives. Adults often lose that curiosity because social consequences become heavier. We begin protecting identities instead of exploring ideas. The question of the virgin birth therefore becomes larger than a single historical claim. It becomes a mirror reflecting how we approach all controversial subjects. Do we begin by asking what is true, or do we begin by asking what protects our existing worldview? Those are not always the same thing. For many Christians, belief in the virgin birth is connected to broader theological convictions about the identity of Jesus, divine action, and the meaning of the incarnation. For many non-believers, skepticism arises from a broader commitment to methodological naturalism or from caution regarding extraordinary historical claims. Both positions emerge from coherent worldviews, even though they reach different conclusions. Understanding that fact does not eliminate disagreement, but it encourages more honest conversation. Instead of assuming bad motives, we can recognize that thoughtful people sometimes evaluate the same evidence differently because they begin with different philosophical premises. That realization should produce humility rather than arrogance. The more closely we examine difficult questions, the more we discover that reality often refuses to fit into neat categories. We crave certainty because uncertainty feels like standing on unstable ground. Yet intellectual maturity sometimes means resisting the temptation to claim more certainty than the available evidence allows. Whether someone ultimately accepts the virgin birth as historical fact, theological truth, symbolic narrative, or unresolved question, the process of reaching that conclusion matters. Did they inherit it without reflection, or did they wrestle with it honestly? Did they dismiss opposing arguments without listening, or did they understand them before disagreeing? Those questions may reveal more about intellectual character than the final conclusion itself. If conversations like this challenge you to examine assumptions carefully, weigh evidence thoughtfully, and remain open to difficult questions without abandoning intellectual honesty, consider subscribing and continuing that journey of thoughtful inquiry. The longer you stay with this question, the more you begin to notice that it is no longer just about whether one extraordinary event happened 2,000 years ago. It becomes a question about how human beings decide what deserves their trust. Every day you believe countless things that you have never personally verified. You believe cities exist that you have never visited. You believe scientific discoveries that you have never repeated in a laboratory. You believe family stories that happened before you were born. Human life depends on trust, because no individual can investigate everything from the beginning. The real challenge is determining which sources deserve confidence and why. That is where the discussion surrounding the virgin birth becomes especially revealing. It forces us to ask whether historical testimony, theological conviction, philosophical assumptions, and personal experience should all carry the same weight. Most people have never consciously answered that question. They simply inherited an answer without realizing it. If you grew up in a deeply religious environment, the supernatural may have seemed like a perfectly reasonable category. If God exists, then miracles are not impossible by definition. They may be rare, but they are not irrational. On the other hand, if you grew up believing that every event should ultimately be explained through ordinary natural processes, then miraculous claims immediately face a much higher burden of proof. Neither starting point is neutral. Both involve philosophical commitments that shape how evidence is interpreted long before any individual piece of evidence is examined. This is why debates over religion often appear to go in circles. The disagreement is rarely about one isolated fact. It usually begins much deeper than that. Imagine two investigators standing in front of the same set of footprints. One believes humans are the only intelligent beings capable of making them. The other believes another possibility exists. They may study the same impressions in the ground, yet reach different conclusions because they disagree about what kinds of explanations are even possible. Something similar happens whenever miraculous claims are discussed. Historians generally work by asking what explanation best accounts for surviving evidence, while recognizing that history cannot recreate the past with scientific certainty. It deals in probabilities, not mathematical proofs. That distinction matters because many people expect history to function like a laboratory experiment. It cannot. Ancient history depends on documents, archaeology, cultural context, language, and comparison between sources. Every conclusion carries degrees of confidence rather than absolute certainty. This reality sometimes disappoints people who hope historical study will completely settle questions of faith. Instead, it often sharpens the questions. When scholars compare the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke, they observe that each author emphasizes different themes. Matthew presents Jesus in ways that frequently echo patterns from Israel's scriptures, highlighting fulfillment and continuity. Luke gives greater attention to unexpected reversals, marginalized people, and divine intervention in ordinary lives. Some scholars argue that these distinct emphases reflect different theological purposes rather than contradictory intentions. Others point out tensions in chronology or narrative details and argue that these differences complicate attempts to harmonize every element. The existence of debate itself is not evidence that either position is correct. It simply demonstrates that serious readers have reached different conclusions after examining the same texts. That should remind us that disagreement alone is not proof of confusion. Sometimes it is the natural consequence of wrestling honestly with ancient sources that do not answer every modern question. There is another psychological pattern worth noticing. People often confuse familiarity with certainty. A story repeated every year gradually stops sounding extraordinary because repetition creates comfort. The mind becomes accustomed to ideas that once would have seemed astonishing. In many parts of the world, the virgin birth is so woven into holiday traditions that people rarely pause to ask what the claim actually means. If someone heard the same story for the first time today, without any cultural background, the reaction might be very different. Some would immediately believe it because they already believe divine intervention is possible. Others would reject it because it conflicts with their expectations about biology and history. Still others would suspend judgment, recognizing that extraordinary claims deserve careful examination, while also admitting that historical distance limits certainty. That middle position is often the least emotionally satisfying because it resists both easy affirmation and easy dismissal. Yet intellectual patience frequently lives in that uncomfortable space. Human beings are not naturally patient thinkers. We prefer quick conclusions because they reduce uncertainty. Social media rewards certainty. Public debates reward confidence. Communities reward loyalty. Quiet reflection rarely receives applause. Yet many of the most important questions in life cannot be answered responsibly at the speed of a headline. Consider how often identity shapes perception. A person who has spent decades building their life around a particular theological framework may feel genuine fear when encountering arguments that challenge it. That fear does not automatically invalidate their beliefs. It simply reminds us that beliefs are rarely isolated ideas. They are connected to family, friendships, purpose, rituals, memories, and hope. Likewise, someone who built their identity around skepticism may also resist evidence or arguments that appear to support religious claims because accepting them could require re-examining deeply held assumptions. Confirmation bias does not belong to one side. It belongs to human nature. Recognizing that fact should make all of us slower to assume that our own reasoning is completely objective. The ancient world itself complicates modern expectations. People living in the 1st century did not divide reality into the same categories that many modern societies do. Religious experience, communal identity, and historical memory were closely intertwined. That does not mean ancient people were incapable of distinguishing reality from fiction. It does mean that their methods of communicating significance were shaped by literary conventions and cultural expectations different from ours. Interpreting ancient texts responsibly therefore requires asking not only what happened, but also how ancient authors intended their audiences to understand what they wrote. Some readers emphasize literary genre, others emphasize historical testimony. Many scholars combine both approaches, recognizing that theological meaning and historical intention are not necessarily mutually exclusive. One of the most interesting questions concerns why the early Christian movement preserved accounts that would likely have invited skepticism. Claims of miraculous births were never universally persuasive. They required explanation then, just as they do now. For believers, the narratives point toward the conviction that Jesus' identity cannot be understood merely through ordinary categories. For skeptics, the same narratives may appear to reflect theological development within early Christian communities. Each interpretation attempts to explain why these stories emerged and why they were preserved. Deciding between them involves more than counting manuscripts or comparing vocabulary. It also involves broader judgments about worldview, probability, and the limits of historical reasoning. Notice how easily discussions become polarized. One side sometimes portrays absolute certainty as faithfulness. The other sometimes portrays absolute skepticism as intellectual sophistication. Yet reality is often more demanding than either extreme. Honest investigation requires acknowledging strong arguments wherever they appear, even when they challenge our preferences. It also requires admitting where evidence is incomplete. There is a difference between saying something cannot be demonstrated through historical methods and saying it therefore could not have happened. Those are separate claims. History may leave some questions unresolved, not because the answers do not exist, but because the available evidence cannot eliminate every reasonable alternative. That realization can feel frustrating, especially for people who desperately want final certainty. But perhaps certainty has never been the ultimate goal. Perhaps the deeper challenge is learning to think carefully without becoming cynical, and to remain open without becoming gullible. Those qualities are harder to cultivate than simple confidence, They require intellectual discipline, emotional maturity, and the willingness to separate personal identity from immediate conclusions. Most people never reach that point, because belonging often feels more valuable than questioning. We naturally seek communities where our assumptions are reinforced rather than examined. Yet every meaningful search for truth eventually demands moments of solitude where inherited ideas must stand on their own. No parent, pastor, professor, author, or public figure can do that work for you. They can offer arguments, evidence, traditions, and interpretations, but they cannot replace your responsibility to examine them honestly. The question is not whether you will trust someone, you inevitably will. The real question is whether you have reflected carefully on why you trust the voices you do. That habit of reflection extends far beyond discussions about Christianity. It influences how you evaluate politics, science, relationships, history, and even your own memories. The uncomfortable truth is that the human mind is remarkably skilled at protecting conclusions it reached for emotional reasons, while convincing itself those conclusions were purely rational. Becoming aware of that tendency does not eliminate it, but it makes humility possible. Humility is not the absence of conviction. It is the recognition that sincere people can sometimes disagree because they are navigating complex questions with incomplete information. That recognition transforms difficult conversations from battles to opportunities for understanding. It allows us to distinguish between attacking people and examining ideas. It reminds us that changing one's mind is not necessarily a sign of weakness, nor is maintaining a conviction after careful examination necessarily a sign of stubbornness. What matters is whether the search has been honest. If that search continues to matter to you, if you value asking difficult questions with intellectual care rather than settling for comfortable assumptions, then stay with this conversation and subscribe so that these explorations can continue together. Eventually, the conversation reaches a place where historical arguments alone are no longer enough. You can compare manuscripts, examine linguistic details, study ancient cultures, read the conclusions of historians from different perspectives, and still discover that one final decision remains yours. Not because evidence has become irrelevant, but because evidence always has to be interpreted through a framework. This is true in religion, but it is also true in nearly every important decision you have ever made. Two people can experience the same event and honestly remember it differently. Two investigators can agree on every fact and still disagree about what those facts mean. Two historians can accept the same documents while assigning different levels of confidence to their conclusions. That reality should not make you despair. It should make you careful. The danger is not simply believing something that turns out to be false. The greater danger is becoming the kind of person who stops examining why they believe what they believe. Once that happens, the mind slowly exchanges curiosity for certainty, and certainty becomes part of identity. From that point forward, changing your mind no longer feels like correcting a mistake. It feels like destroying yourself. That psychological shift explains why discussions about religion often become intensely personal within minutes. Very few people experience the question of the virgin birth as a detached historical puzzle. For many Christians, it is connected to the identity of Jesus, the nature of God, the trustworthiness of Scripture, and the hope that God acts within history. For many skeptics, it represents a broader question about whether extraordinary supernatural claims should ever be accepted without extraordinary evidence. Those positions are not merely intellectual. They are connected to entire ways of seeing reality. That is why conversations frequently generate more heat than light. Each side often assumes the other must be ignoring something obvious, when in reality, they may simply be beginning from different philosophical assumptions. Imagine two architects examining the same foundation. One believes the structure was designed according to a detailed blueprint. The other believes it emerged through natural processes over time. Every crack, every stone, every measurement may be observed equally well by both, yet each observation fits into a different explanatory model. Unless they first discuss those underlying assumptions, every later disagreement becomes inevitable. The same pattern appears in discussions about miracles. If someone believes that a transcendent God exists and can act in history, then the virgin birth is not dismissed because it is miraculous. It is evaluated within a worldview where miracles are possible, even if they are rare. If someone believes that natural explanations should always be preferred unless no alternative exists, then the same account will naturally receive much greater scrutiny. Neither person is simply reading words on a page. Each is bringing an entire understanding of reality into the room. Recognizing this does not eliminate disagreement, but it helps explain why intelligent, informed, and sincere individuals sometimes reach different conclusions after studying the same material for years. That realization should produce intellectual humility rather than contempt. Humility has become strangely unpopular. Modern culture often rewards people who sound completely certain, even when discussing subjects filled with complexity. Social media algorithms amplify confidence because confidence attracts attention. A hesitant voice that carefully distinguishes between what is known, what is probable, and what remains uncertain rarely goes viral. Yet that careful voice is often closer to genuine wisdom than the loudest one in the room. Wisdom is comfortable saying, "I do not know," when the evidence does not justify stronger claims. It is equally willing to say, "I have reasons for believing this," even while recognizing that reasonable people disagree. That balance is difficult because the human mind prefers simple stories. Simplicity reduces anxiety. Complexity demands patience. Think about your own life for a moment. How many opinions do you currently hold because you thoroughly investigated them yourself? Probably fewer than you imagine. Most of us inherit our worldview long before we begin critically examining it. We inherit language, customs, moral intuitions, political assumptions, religious traditions, and cultural expectations. None of that is inherently bad. Every human being begins life by trusting others. The problem appears only when inherited ideas become permanently immune to examination. The most dangerous beliefs are not necessarily false beliefs. They are beliefs that have been placed beyond questioning. History repeatedly demonstrates that civilizations, institutions, and individuals are capable of sincere error. People have defended mistaken scientific theories, inaccurate historical claims, harmful social practices, and destructive ideologies with complete confidence. Confidence protected none of those ideas from eventually being challenged. That observation should encourage caution whenever we feel tempted to assume that certainty alone settles a debate. It does not. The virgin birth therefore becomes a surprisingly powerful case study in intellectual character. It asks whether you are willing to examine evidence without panic. It asks whether you can separate criticism of an idea from rejection of a person. It asks whether your commitment is ultimately to truth or merely to preserving the comfort of familiar conclusions. Those questions remain valuable, regardless of where you eventually land. Some viewers may conclude that the historical and theological case for the virgin birth is persuasive. Others may conclude that the available historical evidence is insufficient to justify belief in such an extraordinary event. Others may remain undecided, recognizing both the significance of the tradition and the limits of historical inquiry. Each of those positions carries responsibilities. The believer should avoid pretending that every historical question has been conclusively answered when scholars continue to debate important details. The skeptic should avoid assuming that methodological limits automatically disprove theological claims. The undecided should avoid mistaking temporary uncertainty for intellectual failure. Honest inquiry is not measured by how quickly it reaches conclusions, but by how responsibly it handles evidence along the way. One of the greatest ironies of human nature is that we often fear uncertainty more than falsehood. We would rather possess an incorrect answer than admit we are still searching. Search feels exhausting. It requires effort without immediate reward. Yet nearly every meaningful discovery begins with someone refusing to accept easy certainty. That does not mean every traditional belief is wrong. Many inherited beliefs survive scrutiny remarkably well. Others become stronger after careful examination because they are no longer accepted merely through habit, but through considered conviction. The goal is not to replace faith with skepticism or skepticism with faith. The goal is to replace intellectual laziness with intellectual honesty. Those are very different things. Honest people can disagree. Honest people can revise their conclusions. Honest people can also maintain deeply held convictions after examining competing arguments fairly. What matters most is the integrity of the process. If this discussion has accomplished anything, perhaps it is simply this. The next time you encounter a claim that feels emotionally important, pause before defending it or rejecting it. Ask yourself why it feels important. Ask which assumptions you are bringing into the conversation. Ask whether your first reaction came from evidence or identity. Ask whether you would evaluate the same evidence differently if it supported the opposite conclusion. Those questions are uncomfortable because they turn the investigation inward. They remind us that the greatest obstacle to understanding is often not a lack of information, but an unwillingness to examine ourselves. Whether the virgin birth ultimately stands before you as historical reality, theological mystery, symbolic proclamation, or unresolved question, one lesson reaches beyond the debate itself. Truth does not become truer because it is familiar. Error does not become correct because it is ancient. Doubt is not automatically wisdom. Faith is not automatically ignorance. The real challenge is learning to pursue truth with enough courage to follow evidence wherever it leads, and enough humility to recognize the limits of your own understanding. Very few people ever develop both qualities at the same time. Those who do usually become less interested in winning arguments and more interested in asking better questions. And perhaps that is where genuine wisdom begins, not with the comforting illusion that every mystery has been solved, but with the quiet determination to keep seeking what is true, even when the answer is more complicated than you hoped. If you value conversations that challenge assumptions without demanding easy conclusions, subscribe and continue exploring these questions with an open mind, because the pursuit of truth is rarely finished, and the willingness to keep asking thoughtful questions may be one of the most important habits you ever develop.